One of my team members always comes into a Zoom meeting and says, in respect to Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, she always says, "Haddly doodly." And so, haddly doodly to everybody here, and welcome to another installment of the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Wynn, founder of Psychedelic Passage, and your host. It's really, really great to be here with you all. It is late June 2025. You might hear a little bit of coarseness in my voice, and that's because we are just getting back from the Psychedelic Science 2025 conference in Denver, Colorado. And so I have been probably talking for days on end. And so I'm grateful that my voice is still intact and I get to be here with you all on another episode of our podcast. You know, really surprisingly and unexpected at this conference was the number of people who reached out to us and stopped us and let us know that they had gone through a program or listened to our content. And I usually don't get that level of full circleness to know that anything that I talk about here on the podcast, I actually hear somebody tell me that it was impactful or it was helpful. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much to those folks that I got to chat with. And that really just inspires me to know that whatever we're doing here, we're doing something meaningful that may help to be impactful to each and every one of you, the audience and the listeners of our podcast. So thank you. We will kick off with a Q&A from a couple of weeks ago. We had one of our free live events in our online community. And this individual asked, which I thought this was a pretty important thing to bring up. They asked, how important is it to do MDMA the day prior to psilocybin? And when this question was asked, myself and the facilitator who was on with us, we kind of looked at each other almost in a way of like, who's given this person this information? Because it's a little bit of a loaded question. I think doing MDMA prior to psilocybin, we first have to back up and talk about when and why people are interested in using MDMA prior to psilocybin, or also using MDMA and psilocybin as an adjunct, let's say in a polysubstance situation. There is some, clinical context here where there are clinical trials for MDMA. There are obviously clinical trials for psilocybin. There is a history of psychedelic therapy involving a stacking of both MDMA and psilocybin. And my opinion on this is that most folks who are exploring therapeutic psychedelic use are likely newer to psychedelics or are returning back to it after 30 or 40 years. And so people who are not used to the psychedelic state or altered states of consciousness in general, I think a facilitator, it might make some sense to gear that person towards MDMA. It's slightly less psychedelic. It has a fairly predictable onset and expected experience. And I find that for people who may not have the full history of a full psychedelic experience, I think that many facilitators think that MDMA can kind of warm somebody up to a psilocybin experience, especially with its entheogenic properties or empathogenic properties, meaning the heart opening experience, the connecting to themselves or loved ones, and even the facilitator, right? So there can be a great foundation of trust that can be built. I see people stacking MDMA and psilocybin. I've certainly worked with clients like that in the past, but I don't know if it's as rigid as saying that you have to do MDMA the day prior to psilocybin. I actually would caution against this because both are serotonergic, and I think MDMA particularly takes a heavier bioload, I believe, on both your serotonin levels, which and just physiologically on you, which leads to more recovery time. Folks report more fatigue, more almost hangover type symptoms, because MDMA can really, really use your serotonin levels. So if you moved into a psilocybin experience the next day, then you're working with less serotonin in your system, which actually might impact your psilocybin experience. So at the end of the day, I think that there could be different combinations here and different polysubstance things, but my best advice for folks is start with one substance if you are unfamiliar. And the rule of thumb with MDMA broadly is that you want to give it about 30 days in between other serotonergic psychedelic experiences. So I think the name of the game here, without, having this be formal advice, if I were this person, I would maybe consider MDMA and psilocybin only after I've had adequate individual solo substance experiences, meaning one substance. Obviously, you can get support. And then that way you can have a better sense on, okay, what is it about MDMA that's working versus, psilocybin? I also see people just being in retreat settings, which I get, and some folks will have certain dosage days with certain substances depending on the day. But I think it's just important to ask the practitioner, ask the service provider why they do it, where their philosophy is around it. And anyone who has a fairly good approach to this should be able to answer that in a pretty intelligent way. So thank you to the individual asking that question. I really hope that you find your pathway with either MDMA, psilocybin, neither or both. Today's topic, we've been circling around this topic for quite a while, and I want to give folks a pretty thorough and actionable and tangible breakdown on choosing individual and group experiences. And, we've touched upon a couple of related topics. Like I've spoken before in a podcast about choosing supported versus solo experiences where you are kind of trip sitting for yourself. We've talked a little bit about individual and collective grief and trauma. We've had my friend Justin Townsend from Myco Meditations on talking about, retreat work. But I don't think that we've done an episode specifically about individual versus group. So we are going to address that today. And we're going to talk about a couple of things. Why I believe people choose one or the other. I want to kind of run through a laundry list of the pros and cons of each across a variety of different criteria when I'm kind of sizing up individual versus group. Before all this, I'll even talk about like a cultural perspective on why I think, this matters, which ultimately adds up to hopefully you as a listener or viewer at the end of this episode having a little bit more discernment or at least tools to determine which one is right for you in the specific moment. Because surprise, surprise, as I joke on this podcast, most of the answers that I have here are, well, it depends. So this is another It Depends episode. But I think if you hang with me, you'll hopefully learn something, hear something that might be helpful for you, or at a minimum, raise some questions so that we can have an open dialogue about this as a community, okay? So I'm going to sip some tea because you're hearing my voice doing its voice thing. And let's dive in. So to add some context to all of this before I get into the nitty gritty of it, the pros and cons and the tangible and actionable, I want to zoom out first to talk about this within a cultural context before I speak more about pros and cons and like strategic advice here. I'll first give note that across the wide array of psychedelic substances, both plant and fungi, but mostly natural medicines, although there is a benefit, I think, in a case for synthetic substances within our society here in the United States. I'll just say that there are some medicines that have a deeper historical, cultural, and societal context that likely gears these medicines to be done in group, according to various traditions or cultures or medicine lineages. I'm primarily thinking about ayahuasca or yagé. Those clearly seem to be medicines that default to group work And then I think that there are some cases where those medicines can be used in an individual context, but likely with the support of a greater community. I'm thinking dietas where you are working with, let's say, a master plant, and you are going off into the local land and just sitting with this plant. A lot of the work is you solo, but there is this like group holding aspect. Maybe you have an energetic tether, an anchor to a teacher or a supporter or a community of folks who are like afar, like geographically afar. So folks who understand dieta work, which I only understand from a theoretical perspective, may tune into what I'm talking about here. And so I think first and foremost, when we are thinking about the application of our intersection with these plants and fungi, aka what's the best way for me to go about doing this, I always invite people just to learn about the cultural aspect of it. Now, the interesting thing is with psilocybin mushrooms, which seems to be the prevalent psychedelic that folks here in America are gearing towards, there kind of is a little bit more, I want to be careful the way that I say this, but a little bit more open interpretation around whether it should be used in an individual or group context. Psilocybin mushrooms are multicultural, really, somewhat like, I don't even want to say like multinational, but psilocybin mushrooms proliferate likely on every single continent in the world, and likely so in many different countries. And here in North America, we have some history and evidence of psilocybin being used as a sacrament, a religious sacrament in Native American specific traditions, but then also a lot of this work coming from Mexico and indigenous peoples such as the Mazatec, for example. And so the funny thing also with psilocybin is that it is a fungi that is fairly easy to access and grow and cultivate as it relates to other psychedelic substances, where it's pretty rare for somebody to build almost like an individual relationship with the psychedelic substance via cultivating it and caring for it and all of that. Now, this is not a legal conversation. Obviously, people know the federal legality of cultivating mushrooms, but what I'm saying is that in certain states where it's legal, let's say Colorado, people do get this kind of rare opportunity to cultivate the mushroom. Like, I didn't understand the depth of my relationship with cannabis until I grew the plant and got my hands in the soil and took care of the plant, which totally deepened my respect for that plant, right? So just an example. I think to cut to the chase here, to talk about why this cultural lens matters, here's my thesis, is that the orientation of what somebody is geared towards, whether they have a proclivity towards individual experiences or group experiences, I think is largely influenced by the societal context of the country or the place that they live in. For example, America is very individually oriented. We have things like individual therapy, but not so much, let's say, like group therapy or some of those things. Those support systems are out there, but when we think about therapy here in this country, we think about like one-on-one. Or when we think about coaching, we think about one-on-one or in a group. And so America is very individually oriented, and we see that in our mental health and medical systems, meaning that a lot of the approach that folks have with, let's say, mental health, medical health, or even the overlap that has with somebody exploring psychedelics for positive benefit, is many folks are wanting to alleviate some type of internal something going on with them, whether it's a trauma, a grief, whether it's a mental health related issue, a symptomatic, thing. But most folks are viewing psychedelics in an individual sense on what can this mushroom or this psychedelic substance do for me. And I think secondary, do people view, okay, well, what can this experience do for me as it relates to the greater good? I think it's a little bit more natural for people to be like, okay, well, if I work on my own healing, then I can show up better for my family and my community. But I don't think that there are many people who default right away to saying, I want to have a psilocybin experience solely for the community, solely for the collective good, right? Not that there's anything wrong with that. I just am noting the propensity that people orient and gear towards. I believe that a lot of this is based on our social construct. For example, other countries are not so individualistic or as emphasized on individual rights and individual expression, right? There are some cultures and countries that have more familial ties and orientation, like Mexico. If you have had the blessing of, getting to be with any of your Mexican friends, you know that there's a lot of generational folks, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, right? Like the family unit is just larger. I experienced the same being Vietnamese. Like the family unit's different, and it's multi-generational with likely many different generations within one household. The nuclear American family doesn't have that as much, right? I'll even go deeper to say that there are some other countries and cultures that emphasize the collective over the individual. Something that I lightly experienced when I was in Japan, for example. And there is this sense of the collective and greater good over the individual. I also know, for example, Japan has almost like a hierarchy type cultural aspect, meaning like a person's role in relation to the other is very important to them. So I would suspect that if there were psychedelic medicine lineages in Japan, which I'm guessing there are, I would guess that they might lean more collective and familial or even hierarchically oriented. So what does that mean for this conversation? What I'm really trying to do is dispel the illusion that one is better than the other, individual versus group. And I believe that there are greater forces at play, not just within the person, but within the environment and the culture that a person lives, that actually influence what is right for the person at the time. And so let's dive into this a little bit. So what I want to do is I want to talk about individual versus group considerations, let's say, across a variety of different lenses. And I hope that by the end of this, you will start to formulate your own criteria on what is right for you. So what I'll do is just starting off with the practical. I think first and foremost, accessibility and availability is really the cornerstone of all of this, because it doesn't matter. I can talk all day about the pros and cons of individual versus group. If you don't have access to it, then it's a little bit of a moot point. So ideally, you should have fair access to both, but you may not due to a variety of different factors. Things like your ability to travel, things like who your service and care options are within your local area. I think there's also things like privilege and buffer to legal ramifications. It's pretty clearly known that there are certain populations that are more at risk of drug-related offenses than other certain populations. So there's a little bit of that access of privilege there as well. And also, I think that just the ability to travel also carries some privilege to it. I know that times are hard economically for many folks, and you may have a great sense that individual work is right for you, but you may not be able to afford it or have the means, which leads to the other part, like financial considerations. And largely what I find is that individual, whether solo, unsupported, obviously is a different story, but let's just assume that you're getting some type of professional care whether in a regulated setting, clinical setting, community setting, religious setting, right? You're working with some type of group or individual people who know what they're doing. One-on-one work is just more costly. You know that at the gym, if you're getting a personal trainer with an hour one-on-one time versus you doing a group cycling class, for example. And so that kind of leads to the next piece, which I think, when we're looking at the practical, that's a whole lens of assessment. But once you get a little bit further, I think that there are kind of 2 or 3 other things that might be important for you. One is assessing the level of care you need and if group is adequate, because I think that most people would benefit from a financial perspective in working in group. But of course, if you're in a local group versus a retreat setting, and if it's a domestic retreat setting, it might be a little bit more cost effective than an international retreat setting, right? So there's these other factors that are in play. But I see that folks are typically moving in this dynamic of it may be a little bit more cost effective for me to be in group. And so that leads to the question of how involved do you suspect your care to be? And by the way, it's not always that trade-off of cost versus group, because I also know that group can be a very powerful container that people choose into regardless of the cost. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But to go back about what I'm saying about assessing your level of care, I really think that in order to do that, you may benefit from just like assessing the depth of your content. And we all have various levels of content that we know of or don't know of or perceive or know to be, or a lot of content that's in the unknown. Like I talk to folks who are like, I feel like there's stuff underneath the surface, but I don't quite know exactly what it is. And I'm just like curious about what's going to come out. I talk to other people who are like, I clearly identify that there's some deep, deep stuff in my history. And I actually wonder what the right environment is for me to do that. And so I say that if you are feeling a big exclamation point on either the volume or type of content that you're experiencing, and you may have the intuition that this content might be a little bit more challenging, you may want a little bit more in-depth care one-to-one. Maybe a facilitator who can work with you specifically in prep, identify this content, work with you in ceremony, work with you in integration. It very much has that more like personalized approach. To play devil's advocate with myself, not everybody needs that, but I know that sometimes in group settings, an individual may be having something large come up in their experience, but they may not know if it's okay for them to take up that much bandwidth or air in the psychedelic container. This leads into, some dynamics of people feeling like it's okay to center their process, or whether it's okay for them to ask for help. But when you're in a one-on-one container and it's just you there, maybe with a supporter, maybe with an emergency contact and a facilitator, clinical provider, or whatever, then by default, the focus is on you. And so that may open up more ability to ask for care and center your content. I also think that people just naturally are inclined to different social preferences and bandwidth. Some folks are just more geared to being introverted. Some folks are a little bit more extroverted. I think that some folks are more individualistically oriented, given the context of their life. Some are more collective, the same as I talk about in, the cultural aspect here. And it might not even be that straightforward. Like I know that there are very introverted and almost separately people who identify as socially awkward who feel like they actually want to be in a group to unlock something within them. I also conversely know, for example, just kind of spitting out a couple of profiles that I've seen here, there are other people who play a large role in their communities. Maybe they're a caretaker, maybe they're a mom, maybe they're a care provider or first responder. And so they're used to being in community almost to the point where they put their needs secondary, let's say. And so they actually benefit from an individual container because there's no escaping that focus on you. And some folks may benefit from that. Like, okay, let's remove all of the excuses. Like, I know that I fawn over folks as a way to cope with my own needs. And if I'm in a group container, it can be easy for me to prioritize the experience of this other person over my own. So if you identify that about yourself, your natural tendency, that can really, really help. And again, sometimes it's about almost like exposure therapy, meaning like, I am uncomfortable in these types of settings. Therefore, I want to expose myself to that. I'm usually, for example, a loner and have trouble asking for help. Maybe in a group container, I can be brave enough to ask for help. Or you might say, I hold so much for so many people in my life as it is. Maybe it's my turn. Maybe it's time for me to just give myself permission to focus on myself, right? So there's a number of different things that an individual, would track, or to at least have just a real earnest conversation with themselves about what their existing support system looks like, what has helped them to thrive or to unlock the next step in their own healing process, and what might be a good next step to keep that momentum going. I think a couple other thoughts as we get a little closer to wrapping up here is that I sense that there's a lot of room in the middle here, right? So what I'm representing are two different ends of the spectrum, individual versus group, but in the name of empowering you, the journeyer, just know that there's probably a lot of ways that this can look. I have seen people almost hybrid their experience, where maybe they're joining like an online community like ours to do group prep and group integration, but they are having a solo experience or an experience with just them and one facilitator. Conversely, I've seen people pick a specialist for preparation and integration, but then also know that they're going to go on this group retreat where a lot of the work is going to be collective. And just because one is right for you in the moment doesn't mean that that's your default style forever. I also think that there's just something to consider about group experiences. And I think that there's two things that I want to highlight here. One is that anybody who has been in group ceremony will attest to this interesting dynamic where I do believe the nature of these medicines is for us to engage in community. Whether that's during the psychedelic event or experience or not, I think is up for argument here. But I have been in specific group ceremonies where another individual is going through something really challenging across the room. And let's say they end up purging or releasing that somatically or in whatever way. And somehow their work was done, almost feels like it was on behalf of me. Somehow something that they're doing and their bravery reflects into a component of my experience. I also have been in certain scenarios where an individual's experience is so large and loud in a group container, both literally and figuratively, to the point where it is actually like taking up a lot of the space as well. And then that leads into an interesting dynamic about etiquette. What's okay? When is it not okay? Is there an auxiliary space for this person to go to for them to continue to feel care while not disrupting the collective experience that's going on? And that's really tricky for facilitators to navigate that stuff in real time. And so there's really no wrong answers here, but I want to paint a picture so that folks know what they are getting into. And many times, folks who are in group containers really don't get to meet their co-participants until, let's say, a couple of days or a week, or even as folks are traveling in, as is usually the case in retreat settings. And so I find it really promising for hybrid processes to emerge, especially in rural communities, especially in underserved communities from a mental health and support standpoint. And I believe that hybrid processes will really, really emerge for folks. I think as I wrap all of this up, I want to share that no matter what, I truly believe that whether you go for an individual experience or a group experience, that there really is something about the power of being witnessed, the power of being acknowledged, the power of being seen, and the power of doing this work out of isolation. Even if somebody is not fully aware or understanding of your experience, even if they are not there with you during your experience, the ability for us to share, the ability for us to tell, the ability for us to express goes a really long way for two reasons. One is that when we start to share with people who can hold our stories, we are getting it out of the trap up here, because if it just lives up here, then there can be a real gap in how to bring it forward into our lives. I think that that's one aspect of it. Like, it becomes more real when you recount and tell and share your story, your experience. Like, yeah, that happened. Because as you've heard me say, the mind is very powerful. The narrative and the memory that we have of these experiences are quite fallible. And so the more that we speak about it, I think the better. If that is just in preparation or integration, I think that is okay. I do know, though, that there's quite a bit of magic and I think quite a bit of therapeutic value when you can go through something quite personable or vulnerable or meaningful in your psychedelic experience. And there's somebody there who can compassionately and non-judgmentally witness it and hold it. Now, in order for that to happen, you have to have the proper power dynamics in check. You have to have the right ethical consent and safety and communication and rapport built. But that needs to be figured out regardless of whether you go through individual or group or not. So it's the same fundamentals, folks. We talk a lot about harm reduction, but we're also talking about benefit maximization, and the same tenets and principles apply, okay? So we're going to wrap up, as always, with a couple of testimonials. I'll just read a couple of shorter ones, and we have a few of some program participants who went through our macrodose program. The first person says, "My facilitator match is exactly what you want/need as a facilitator. They understand the medicine, they know when to engage and when to lay back. Their personality is perfect for this work. I had great trust in them and would use them again in a heartbeat if I wanted to do a macrodose trip again. Their beforehand prep and after journey integration was very helpful." Okay, here's another one from a different journeyer and facilitator match. "My facilitator was highly knowledgeable and professional, as well as kind and thoughtful. He knows a lot about trauma work and did a trauma-informed approach, which was especially helpful for me. He is also very much in service." Yeah, I love that. Okay, last one here. "My facilitator is intelligent, easygoing, open-minded, helpful, non-judgmental, and kind. I feel that I benefited greatly from my experience. I do feel I have more work to do." That's about the truest statement that I've heard in a while. I think most folks who come out of psychedelic experiences realize how much more work they have to do. So that wraps it up for us here at the Psychedelic Passage podcast. I want to hear your thoughts. What did I get right? What did I miss? If you've experienced individual or group, maybe I want to hear what your experience is like and if you favor one or the other. So you can comment in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on the YouTube videos that we upload. And on behalf of myself, our community, and every other individual out there who has more work to do, thank you so much for being here on this episode and a part of our psychedelic community, which is growing and growing every day. And I look forward to seeing you next time on the Psychedelic Passage podcast.